Trump claimed we have done it right. Is there anything we've done right in this?
아이고. 안녕하세요. 매일매일 운동하기를 실천하고 있는 동탄 왕코입니다. 오랜만에 해가 떴어요. 구름이 엄청 많이 끼긴 했는데 그래도 해가 떴습니다. 다행이네요. 비가 많이 안 와서. 오늘
무풍운전을 종료합니다.
오늘 쉬는 날이에요. 원래 운동을 안 하고 쉬려고 했는데 스트레칭이랑 스트레칭 위주로 하고 이따가 저녁 먹고 나서 다시 운동을 하는 걸로 하겠습니다. 우선 스트레칭을 해야겠어요. 일단 스트레칭을 하겠습니다. 오랜만에 해가 떠서 CNN.
Our public health experts, when we talk about vaccines, and then look to vaccinate everyone when we have a COVID vaccine.
But I'm curious as to how you're going to go about doing that because, even with the COVID vaccine, for something that could be deadly, what is it, some third of Americans say they don't plan on getting it. So how would you do that as a public health policy to try and get more people comfortable with the idea of vaccines?
Well, I think it's going to be different in different communities, but I think this has to be, people have to be educated at the grassroots level. I think, there are, parts of American society that distrust the government. And in those parts, I think it has to come from the people that are trusted in those parts of this country. But the message has to be clear that we won't release a vaccine until it's safe and effective. I hate the phrase warp speed because it sounds like we're just trying to get this out as quickly as possible. We have a saying, during an emergency in the hospital where we work quickly, but we don't rush. And I think that's the message that public has to understand. We're working quickly, but we're not rushing, and we won't release a vaccine unless it's a great vaccine. Restore public confidence in that. We have a cancer vaccine. The HPV vaccine is a cancer vaccine, and barely half of teenagers are up to date on that. So we do have a long way to go.
Now, we used to think that the disease was basically just, it impacted the lungs, but there seems to be more and more evidence it can have devastating effects on the cardiovascular system. We heard the Heart Association this week say the cardiac complications of COVID-19 could be devastating and linger after recovery. And one doctor told CNN, basically it was as if their patients' hearts were on fire. So I want to ask you, you're a cardiovascular specialist. I wonder whether there might be many otherwise healthy people who will have long-term chronic problems because of this virus.
Well, we'll see. We're learning a lot about this disease. This is a brand new disease, and we're learning about it in real time. And unlike sort of the last major pandemic, the HIV/AIDS crisis in the 80s, now information is disseminated on a minute-by-minute basis, so we're learning a lot very quickly. We know that if you're admitted to the hospital with COVID, about a third of those patients will have elevated cardiac enzymes, the muscle enzymes that we used to detect small amounts of heart muscle damage. And there's also been a German study which used MRI data to look at whether people who are recovering weeks out have any evidence of these sort of small scars in the heart, and you can see it in almost 70% of patients. You know, how meaningful these small scars are, we don't know, but we do know that COVID is a systemic disease. It's not just a pulmonary disease, and it's best not to get it. And you know, the message that some people have tried to disseminate, which is, you know, if you're not over 70 years old and you don't have substantial comorbid diseases, you're likely to do fine with this, is not true. It's best not to get this disease. It's best to wear a mask. It's best to social distance. And because we really don't know the long-term consequences of it.
Yet another reason people should take this seriously. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Jonathan Reiner. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
President Trump continues to attack mail-in voting. During a Saturday news conference, he repeated his unproven claims that an election held largely by mail won't be fair or legitimate.
We are going to have an election that takes place on a beautiful day, November 3rd. And usually at the end of the evening, they say, Donald Trump has won the election. Donald Trump is your new president. Whatever they say, you know what? You're not going to know this, possibly, if you really did it right, for months or for years. Because these ballots are all going to be lost. They're going to be gone.
House Democrats are considering possibly cutting their summer recess short to deal with the growing controversy. The newly installed Postmaster General and Republican donor, Louis DeJoy, has been criticized for changes he recently implemented. Now, those changes have effectively slowed down mail service by eliminating worker hours as well as hundreds of sorting machines. CNN confirmed the Inspector General of the Postal Service is now reviewing those recent changes, as well as DeJoy's ethics compliance. Senate Democrat Bernie Sanders responded Saturday with this brief tweet: "The Postmaster General must resign immediately." Meanwhile, congressional leaders are speaking out about the impact President Trump's attacks could potentially have on voters.
오늘 스쿼트 하겠습니다. 오랜만에 스쿼트를 해야겠어.
That I would live to see the United States of America tolerate a tyrant who seems to just trample upon our Constitution, John Lewis, that would be so disappointed that he nearly gave his life to get the vote for people of color, and to watch the complicity of the Republicans in holding on to this kind of shenanigan is just beyond me.
오랜만에 캐틀벨이 등장했습니다.
Continues his attacks on mail-in voting. The U.S. Postal Service is warning of delivery delays to come. CNN's Sarah Westwood has more.
President Trump on Saturday continued to cast doubt on the reliability of mail-in voting, despite experts repeatedly saying that widespread voter fraud in the U.S. is exceedingly rare, and many states have relied on mail-in voting to varying degrees for years. And although the Postmaster General, Louis DeJoy, has made changes to the post office operations that critics say will hamper its ability to deliver mail-in ballots at the volume expected in November, the president praised DeJoy's efforts. He also sought to draw a distinction between absentee voting and mail-in voting.
Louis, he is working very hard, but as you know, the Democrats aren't approving the proper funding for postal, and they're not approving the proper funding for this ridiculous thing that they want to do, which is all mail-in voting.
와, 오랜만에 하겠는데 이렇게만 해도.
Again, absentee voting is great. You request, I'm an absentee voter because I requested, I got, and then I sent in my vote. So that works out very well. That's what we've had. But now they want to send in
밖에 날씨가 너무 좋습니다.
ballots.
나가고 싶네.
They're being lost, they're being discarded, they're finding them in piles. It's going to be a catastrophe.
Now, the president recently requested his own absentee ballot, but the distinction between absentee voting and mail-in voting is not black and white. In fact, the lines between them are pretty blurred. Both are conducted in much the same way. Their ballots are delivered through the mail, and only 9 states in the District of Columbia are doing what the president was warning about, which is mailing every voter a ballot. In most states, people will still have to request a ballot in order to vote. The president's also exploiting the likelihood that the election result may not be entirely clear on election night because it does take longer to count mail-in votes. The president tweeted Saturday morning, "The Democrats know the 2020 election will be a fraudulent mess. We'll maybe never know who won." And meanwhile, the Postal Service in late July warned 46 states in the District of Columbia that their election laws are incompatible with the Postal Service operations. For example, they said that some of the deadlines that states have set for requesting and turning in their ballots just doesn't leave the Postal Service enough time to get those ballots delivered. Sarah Westwood, CNN, Washington.
Meanwhile, President Trump's challengers are preparing for the Democratic National Convention next week. Former Vice President Joe Biden and his new running mate Kamala Harris are getting ready to accept the party's nomination. For now, Harris is taking a step into the spotlight. Jessica Dean tells us more.
Newly minted Vice Presidential nominee Kamala Harris giving her first interview since that announcement was made earlier this week. And in that virtual interview, Harris praising her running mate Joe Biden for having what she calls the audacity to put a black woman on the ticket with him, going also into the policies that they hope to put in place, but continuing to go back to Joe Biden, really playing that traditional role as the vice presidential candidate and elevating the person at the top of the ticket, in this case, that being Joe Biden. Harris also continues to fuel an incredible fundraising boost for the Biden campaign. They announced they've raised $48 million over the 2 days after her announcement, which is just a shocking number considering that earlier in the campaign cycle, Biden wasn't raising that in a whole quarter of fundraising. They're raising that in 48 hours. We're told that both Harris and Biden will be delivering their nomination acceptance speeches right here in Wilmington, Delaware, when the Democratic Convention happens next week. But until then, it's a pretty quiet weekend here in Delaware as Harris and Biden prepare. Jessica Jean, CNN, Wilmington, Delaware.
Protesters in Belarus aren't giving up their fight. They're demanding the country's president step down. Coming up, Fred Plykin tells us what they're risking. Coming up ahead. Stay with us.
All out, driven with determination, endless dedication, tireless, pushing on, breaking all limits. Giving up is not an option. For your health matters most, so we'll never stop advancing ourselves to be ready for anything. BDMS, your trusted healthcare network.
You're taking a flight, your first in a while. At Qatar Airways, we've continued to fly, taking so many people home safely. Changing, adapting, perfecting, making us the world's most experienced airline for passenger safety. So for your first flight into this new world, travel with an airline you can rely on. Ready? Let's go further together. Qatar Airways.
What you doing?
Oh, just seeing if I can find it.
Find what?
The planet you live on.
Okay. Well, the lens cap's on, so.
All new African Voices Changemakers. Create opportunities. Impact communities. Transform lives. Self-made Nigerian Afropop star Mr. Easy helps aspiring artists find their voice.
It's beautiful to be in this position of power. If you have the influence, then you might as well use it.
African Voices Changemakers. Only on CNN.
If the Rolex Submariner looks familiar to you, that's because it is almost without question the most imitated watch design in the world. It was first released in 1954 at the Basel World Watch Fair, and this was very much a dive watch. Of course, it's become a luxury staple over time. We have a rotating external bezel, we have a dark dial, we have luminous indices. All of these things made it attractive for divers like Jacques Cousteau, who wore the watch in his film The Silent World. Of course, this utilitarian dive tool graduated to a style icon when Sean Connery wore it in Dr. No, the James Bond film from 1962. It is the greatest value-retaining watch on the market, meaning that in every year since its release, that it has inflated in price and in value.
아 힘들어.
The president of Belarus doesn't want foreign mediation to calm the protests in his country, saying he, quote, won't give up the country to anyone. But he has reached out to Russian President Vladimir Putin. The protests started this week after a highly contested presidential election. Tens of thousands of people have risked arrest, violence, and even alleged torture to demand Alexander Lukashenko step down. Fred Plankin has the latest.
Protests by the opposition here in Belarus are continuing to swell over the weekend. If we pan over here, we can see this is Pushkin Square, which is at one of the main streets leading into the center of Minsk, the capital of Belarus, and there are literally thousands of people here. The way that they protest is they stand at the side of the street, they've got their flags out, many of them holding flowers in the air, and then the motorists who come by, they honk their horns in support of the opposition. And obviously in this country, which is one of the most repressive in the world, this is something that takes a great deal of courage. There are many people who were arrested here in this country ever since the demonstration started last Sunday after the election here. Thousands of people were arrested, and many of them were beaten while they were in detention. People telling us of torture while they were in detention, and then also people were paraded and humiliated on state TV. Nevertheless, the folks here are still coming out. They're still calling for Alexander Lukashenko to step down, but it seems as though at this point in time, that's not something that he thinks he is going to have to do. In fact, he says that he won the election by around 80% of the vote. He's already spoken to Vladimir Putin and still is very much clinging to power. The opposition here, however, says that he lost the election. They're calling for a new vote. And they're also calling for an end to violence by the police and by other security institutions here in this country. For Plankin, CNN, Minsk, Belarus.
Just ahead on CNN Newsroom.
I want college football to come back.
As more and more college athletes test positive for coronavirus, we'll talk to a top sports doctor about why he thinks the U.S. president might be out of luck.
We knew it was coming. The signs were all there. We knew we had to change, but we didn't. Destroying wild habitats, exploiting wildlife, turning a blind eye. Maybe it would go away. It didn't. It began to bite back. Primates at HIV, civets at SARS, bats and Ebola. COVID-19 is not the first pandemic, and it won't be the last. Unless we deal with the root causes. It's time to stop the wildlife trade and to support compassionate, sustainable farming to protect our planet. Let's change our relationship with nature forever. For all life on Earth.
A year like no other means an election like no other. The 2020 conventions are coming. The Democrats, the Republicans. Special live coverage starts August 18th, only on CNN.
When you travel the world, make sure the world travels with you. Check in, log on, and get connected with all of the latest developments at your fingertips. CNN Partner Hotels. Connected to your world.
They've been coming across sniper fire, gunfire. You can see how intense it is. We have to wrap it up right now.
They feel like they won't be able to outrun the war.
And they thought the whole border was over. These doctors have nerves of steel.
You can't help but be struck by how interconnected our world is.
Arwa Damon, CNN.
I'm Scott McLean in Madrid, Spain, and this is CNN.
Welcome back to you, our viewers in the United States and around the world. I'm Kim Brunhuber, and you're watching CNN Newsroom. U.S. President Donald Trump is calling for the return of college football this fall, even though more college athletes are testing positive for coronavirus.
I want college football to come back. These are strong, healthy, incredible people. These are people that want to play football very badly.
Mr. Trump made these comments as the University of Oklahoma announced that 9 of its players had tested positive for COVID-19, yet the team is still scheduled to open its 2020 season against Missouri State in September. Last week, the Big Ten and the Pac-12 conferences, 2 of what's known as the Power 5, voted to postpone their seasons. Dr. Brian Hainline is the Senior Vice President and Chief Medical Officer for the National Collegiate Athletic Association. Thank you so much for joining us on this important topic. Every day we're seeing more cases of college athletes testing positive for coronavirus. The list of schools and programs is too long to list here, but let me start with this. Given the severity of the pandemic, given we're already seeing so many cases of student athletes testing positive, should